Welcome. I'm Steve Lance, and this is One-on-One. Our guest today is Stephen Mosher, longtime China analyst and the man who directly witnessed the birth of the one-child policy in communist China, in the aftermath of Mao's mass killings and the CCP's manipulation of Western scholars. He joins us today to break down what he saw on the ground in China and how those same tactics have evolved in what he believes is the biggest blind spot about the Communist Party. Here's my conversation with Stephen Mosher. Dr. Stephen Mosher, really an honor to sit down with you.
Well, thank you.
You've written extensively on China over the years. You were also one of the first American scholars granted access to do any type of in-depth research inside of China. Talk to us about what that experience was like and what you came to understand with your own eyes inside of communist China in the 70s.
Well, I arrived in China in March of 1979. I was part of the scholarly exchange group of 50 that was sent to China by the United States after we normalized diplomatic relations. I was the only one in that group allowed to do unsupervised research among the Chinese people themselves. The rest of the members of the group were in nuclear physics and chemical engineering and other sorts of technologies that the Communist Party was desperate to get its hands on as part of the four modernizations. Initially, it's interesting, the Chinese Communist Party turned my research down. The Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs said they didn't want me to come to China. They accepted the other 49, but I was the only exception. I was vetoed. And it was only after President Jimmy Carter brought up the matter with Deng Xiaoping, China's leader at the time, that Deng Xiaoping said it won't be a problem. We will allow this American scholar into China. And so I was able to spend the next year living in a Chinese commune, Equality Commune, it was called, in Chinese Junan Gongsha, and got to learn firsthand what life was like in a giant Chinese commune of 80,000 people. You know, when I went to China, I had been educated at Stanford University. And we had a number of people at Stanford University who were very, very much admirers of the Chinese Communist Party and of Chairman Mao. We had Professor John Gurley in the economics department writing books about how wonderful Mao's economic plans were and how the communes had greatly improved the lives of the Chinese people. We had the former Democrat candidate Kamala Harris's father, Professor Harris at Stanford, who was also a big believer in the success of communist China's effort to create a new socialist man and a new socialist woman. And so those were kind of the attitudes that I took with me when I went to China. It didn't take very long for the Chinese people to convince me that all of that was simply a fantasy created in the minds of Western socialist-minded people, which had nothing to do with the reality on the ground in China itself. First of all, I was taken out by a new friend of mine to a little hill outside the village. And he said this was the hill where, when the Red Army came into the village, they executed all of the former clan elders and the former members of the local militia. Now every village had a militia because that was the local police force to protect them from robbers and bandits. They were all executed. All the guns were confiscated, and the leaders of the village were executed, and new leaders were appointed by the Chinese Communist Party. That was kind of a wake-up call. And then I was doing research in the beginning of the commune movement and learned about the massive famine that had followed the institution of the communes. The famine in my area was a land of fish and rice, as the Chinese say. My area was a place that had not experienced famine in the past because they raised crops of sugarcane, they grew mulberry bushes, they raised silkworms, they sold their silk down the Pearl River to Hong Kong. They had fish ponds where they raised fish. A land of fish and rice, literally. No famines ever. No female infanticide ever. They were able to raise all of their little girls as well as their little boys. And then the commune system happened. And 80,000 people were forced into this giant commune run by Communist Party officials who had no idea what they were doing. Literally no idea when to plant, when to harvest, how you raise silkworms. No idea. They were political actors, solely political actors. The commune quickly fell onto hard times. The people in the commune were initially told, don't worry about cooking anymore, don't worry about where your next meal is going to come from, because we're going to set up commune kitchens. And you're all going to eat for free forever, and you can eat as much as you want. Well, that sounded like, at least to some villagers, kind of like heaven on earth. So the commune kitchens were set up, and 6 months later ran out of food. And the people were sent home to eat out of their own larders, only in the meantime, all of their cookware had been taken by the local Communist Party officials and smelted down in the backyard smelters into pig iron, because Chairman Mao had declared China was going to catch up to Great Britain in iron and steel production in 3 years. And so they had nothing to cook with. And even if they had had a wok, they would have had no rice to put in it. And they starved to death. So I was taken out to a mass grave outside the village, where they had hastily buried 400 people, mostly the very old and the very young, the people who generally die first in a famine. And then, of course, I learned about the Cultural Revolution and the Red Guard fanatics who had come into the village and were accusing people of imaginary crimes and struggling them and punishing them and ultimately killing them. I learned about cases of cannibalism, political cannibalism, literally, where fanatical Red Guards were eating the hearts and livers of their political enemies that they'd killed. On top of all this, and we're talking about human rights violation after human rights violation, tyranny after tyranny, brutality after brutality, the one-child policy began when I was in the village. And I recall very well the evening of March 8th of 1980, because the local Communist Party secretary of the brigade, where I was living, of 5,000 people, came over in the evening, and he was waving a government document. And he said, I've just received this new directive from the Central Committee, and I thought you'd like to see it. Well, of course I wanted to see it. I wanted to see all the documents I could get my hands on. This was particularly interesting because it was a document from the Guangdong Provincial Communist Party Committee, and it said the population of the province of Guangdong was growing too quickly, and that something had to be done, and that the new policy was that the population of Guangdong province could not be allowed to increase more than 1% in the year 1980. Think about that. It's already March of 1980. To conceive and bring a baby to term takes 9 months. So all of the children who were going to be conceived and born in 1980 were already. And so I said, well, what are you going to do? And the secretary of the Communist Party Committee said, it's very simple. We'll do a house-to-house search of the village. We'll identify all of the women who are pregnant with illegal second and third and fourth children. And then we will tell them they must get abortions. And that's exactly what they did. I saw these women arrested. I went with them as they were taken and locked up in commune dormitories for days or weeks at a time. I was there taking pictures and recording, taking notes, while communist officials were telling them they had no choice but to go in for abortion. Communist officials would say things like, you there who are 9 months pregnant, don't think you can simply stay in this lockup until you give birth, because we will not allow you to take your baby home. Should you go into labor before you give us permission to do an abortion, we will simply kill your baby at birth. I went with these women as they were taken to the local medical clinic and aborted by cesarean section. Again, some of them, most of them were 7, 8, 9 months pregnant. In other words, they were already carrying viable unborn children. Had these children been born at 8, 8.5 months, they would have survived quite well. Keep them warm, feed them, and they can breathe on their own. They decided to do two things to stop these babies from being born, to stop the population of Guangdong province from increasing, right? First, they gave a lethal injection into the womb to kill the unborn child. And then 24 to 48 hours later, they would do the cesarean section abortion and remove the now dead or dying baby. But there were women who were brought in at the last minute in labor, too late to give the poison shot into the womb. So what would they do with those? They would take a hypodermic needle, fill the syringe with alcohol or formaldehyde, and wait until the baby's head was crowning. Babies are mostly born head first. And they would inject the alcohol or formaldehyde into the fontanelle, the soft spot in the child's head, and the child would die in convulsions seconds, minutes later. That's how they made sure that no, quote, illegal children were born. Remember, these children had all been conceived when it was legal to have second, third, and fourth children. And these women were suddenly told, and their husbands, and their extended families, that the children had been declared illegal and a death sentence had been visited upon them. I have copies of arrest warrants where women were arrested. For what crime? They were arrested for the crime of being huaiyun, pregnant. And after they were forcibly aborted, they then would sterilize them. They would do a tubal ligation to make sure these violators would never come back in following years pregnant with another illegal child. So they took away the prospect of any future babies being born. And there was, in the 80s and 90s, and until the one-child policy ended, there was an epidemic of suicide in China, which, when in most countries, most suicides are men, elderly men. In China, the suicides were mostly young women. Why were they committing suicide? They were committing suicide because the Communist Party had forcibly aborted a baby they had conceived in love, and they couldn't get over the loss, and so they ended their lives in consequence.
There's been horrific revelations over the past decade in the 2000s of the allegations of forced live organ harvesting inside of China of prisoners, religious prisoners of conscience, whether they be Falun Gong or now the Uyghurs and others. A lot of people's reaction to that is just simply, and there's been films titled with regard to this topic, hard to believe. Based on what you've seen with your own eyes inside of China, do you think that this crime that we're speaking of is possible?
Oh, I think forced organ harvesting in China is a big business. I think that the Chinese Communist Party minions have probably made $10 billion or so, are still making about $10 billion a year off forced organ harvesting. Because you see, they have literally a captive population of people to harvest from. My understanding, and I actually many years ago looked into this whole topic in depth because it was of a piece with the other human rights violations that I had earlier studied in China and documented. And I became convinced that the Falun Gong, first and foremost, but also other political prisoners of conscience and other minorities were being tissue typed when they were arrested. And if they were a tissue match for a Communist Party official who needed a new heart or lung or liver or cornea, that they would be killed for that purpose. I also did research and because into a procedure called ECMO, which is extracorporeal membranous oxygenation. One of my sons was born prematurely and had to have this artificial heart-lung machine, this extracorporeal membranous oxygenation, used to allow his lungs to mature so he could live, and he's quite well and healthy now. He's 30 years old. But this technology was taken to China by a particular doctor and now is used to make organ harvesting even more profitable, because before the advent of this heart-lung machine procedure, you could just harvest a heart, but by the time you harvested the heart, the other organs would have started decaying. Now what you do is you use the extracorporeal oxygenation to continue the blood flow to the organs while you cut off the blood flow to the brain, killing the donor, but allowing you to harvest not just the heart or a liver, but a heart and a liver and a lungs and all the other organs as well, because it keeps the organs perfused with blood. This was the technology. It came from the United States, invented to save lives, which is now being used to make forced organ harvesting in China even more profitable for the communist officials in charge. I have told officials at the Vatican, I have told officials at the US State Department, I have testified before the British Parliament on human rights abuses in China, including these kinds of abuses. I am absolutely convinced that forced organ harvesting began decades ago, and it has gotten more common and more sophisticated over the years, and that people are being deliberately killed in China for their organs. And the only thing you need to know to prove that is happening is that you can order a heart or transplant in advance. That can only happen if someone is killed for the purpose of providing you with that heart. You see, because everywhere else in the world, you sign up and you wait
Months, if not years.
Months, if not years, for a transplant. In China, you sign up and they say, come on October 16th, and we will have your new heart ready and waiting for you. The only way that can happen is if they're killing someone in order to provide that heart for you. So we need to ban people from going to China for organ transplants, because everyone who goes to China for an organ transplant is complicit in the death of an innocent in China.
You've written 12 books now. Your most recent, titled The Devil and Communist China. Tell us about what prompted you to write this book and why this one is important.
I think it's important to call things by their proper names. The great sage Confucius underlined the importance of doing that, calling things by their proper names. If you look at what's happened in China over the last 70 plus years of communist misrule, you have to call it evil. You have to call the destruction of traditional Chinese culture evil. You have to call the destruction of so many human beings, living, breathing images of God, in my view, as evil. And of course, you have to call the destruction of 400 million unborn children and newborn children to be perhaps the greatest evil of all. The Devil in Communist China is a history of the Chinese Communist Party's rule over China, focusing specifically on the first emperor of the Communist dynasty, the Red Emperor Mao Zedong, because I think Mao sort of set the stage for everything that followed. It was his character that was impressed on the Chinese Communist Party very, very early on. And it was his willingness to reject the laws of both God and man, declaring himself as a young man to be Wu Fa Wu Tian, I am without law, I am without God, without Tian, without heaven. Basically setting himself up to be a kind of self-created demigod.
It feels as though the West, America, is more, familiar with the evil nature and the crimes that came out of the Soviet Union, but not so much China. Do you think that the scope of what the CCP has done has been partially overlooked in the West?
No, I think it's been tremendously overlooked. And I think that the use the word scope, which is very interesting, because if we talk about the scope of the killing, for example, the Chinese Communist Party is in first place by far. Not that this is a race that you want to win. You've got Hitler and the Nazis killing 12, 13 million in their camps. You've got Stalin killing 30 or 40 million at most. And then you've got Chairman Mao and the Chinese Communist Party killing much more than that. You've got 45 million people dying in the famine after the Great Leap Forward, for example. You've got tens of millions of people more killed in various purges and persecutions over the years. And then you've got the 400 million little victims of the one-child policy. Let me repeat that number, 400 million. Where does that number come from? In 2012, the Minister of Education of the People's Republic of China came to DC and told a group of congressmen that he was very proud of how successful the one-child policy had been, and that the one-child policy had been responsible for eliminating 400 million people from the Chinese population. And I had to think, I was told by a friend of mine, a congressman who was at that meeting, I had to think how insane that statement was. He was bragging about having eliminated 400 million innocent human beings. He was bragging about eliminating 400 million of the most productive, enterprising people the planet has ever seen. He was bragging about having eliminated half of the last 2 generations of Chinese. And he thinks that China is better off as a result. What sort of a distorted, bizarre, evil mind view do you have to possess to think that that's a good thing? And that comes from Chairman Mao, because Chairman Mao in 1958 reversed his position on population. You see, up to that point, he had been a believer that unemployment was a problem of capitalism, and that in a perfect socialist system, everyone would have work, and so we could never have too many people. Well, he changed his mind in 1958 when there started to be food shortages because of the commune system. And he gave a speech and he said, we need to set up a ministry of reproduction in the same way that we control the production of steel and the production of bicycles. We need to control the reproduction of human beings. That was the first glimpse that you have of what would come down from the Communist Party a couple decades later, namely the one-child policy. And it's been nothing short of an absolute disaster for the Chinese people. The Chinese Communist Party has killed off the Chinese dream. Because of China's population collapse, China's population over the course of the rest of this century will be cut in half or worse.
What would you say is the most misunderstood aspect of China in the among the political class in Washington, as well as in the academic community?
What I had realized when I was in China is that the Communist Party had so destroyed the Chinese economy, both the industrial economy and the rural economy, that they had no choice but to back off for a few years and allow the natural, native entrepreneurial ability of the Chinese people to assert themselves. And this is the most amazing thing to me, and it speaks so well of the character of the Chinese people, is that you have this beast literally riding astride their backs, the Communist Party. 95 million members of the Chinese Communist Party, which doesn't produce anything except tyranny and evil, and lives off the blood, sweat, and tears of the billion-plus Chinese people, and consumes about a third of everything that's produced in China, goes into the coffers of the Chinese Communist Party one way or another, either directly in corruption or indirectly by paying their salaries, by paying their foreign junkets, by building their resorts, by enabling their banquets, and all of the other benefits that the mid-ranking and senior Communist Party leaders achieve. And despite the tyranny, despite the fact that 1/3 of the wealth is siphoned off directly by the party and much of the rest by other taxes, the Chinese people in the 80s, 90s, and early years of this century were still able to improve their lives by such a great amount. It speaks very well of their work ethic and their entrepreneurial ability, that they were able to thrive despite the tyranny over this period of time. A lot of us saw that and we thought, well, surely the Chinese Communist Party will recognize that if it steps back from direct control of the economy and it simply gives the Chinese people a little more breathing room, that everybody will be better off. Well, it didn't realize that. Its natural fallback position is tyranny. Its natural drive is for control. That's what it produces. It produces tyranny. And it has produced under Xi Jinping, especially since 2012, a high-tech digital dictatorship of the kind the world has never seen before. More video cameras, surveillance cameras in Chinese cities than the rest of the world combined. Face recognition technology to track everybody at real time. The social credit system to make sure that everyone's expenditure is being tracked and that no one comments on social media don't go unpunished. The level of control is just incredible. So anyone watching what's been happening in China should have realized, at least by Tiananmen on June 4th, 1989, that this dictatorship was going to do anything necessary to stay in power. And that to the extent that we enabled its rise, we were actually creating a problem for America and the world. And I believe allowing China to join the World Trade Organization was the biggest strategic blunder that America's made, maybe the biggest blunder in human history. We enabled the rise of the power that wants to destroy us, and the Chinese people, for that matter.
There's a discussion among scholars, China watchers, China scholars, or a debate whether or not the dictator, Xi Jinping, is in complete and total control, or if he's paranoid about losing control. What do you think is the state of politics inside of China?
I think the state of politics in China is as divided as it has been since the aftermath of the Great Leap Forward and the famine. People need to know that because of the disaster of the Great Leap Forward and because of the death of 45 million people, Chairman Mao was actually forced out of direct control of the Chinese economy for a number of years. And he launched the Cultural Revolution in reaction to that to take back power from people like Deng Xiaoping and Liu Shaoqi and others who were trying to get the Chinese economy back on track. What we have in China today is an economy that's faltering. It's faltering. Why? It's faltering for three reasons. One, because of the demographic decline. Those hundreds of millions of young people who should be getting married and buying homes and cars aren't there. So there's 70 million empty apartment buildings in China which will not be occupied ever, because the people who would have occupied them and raised families are gone forever. The second thing is, of course, all the misdirected government investment into white elephants, the state-owned enterprises that continue to lose money each year, like China Rail, for example, which is hundreds of millions of dollars in debt. That debt will never be paid off. And then you've got the tariff pressure, the pressure from the tariffs of Donald Trump. The only sector of the Chinese economy that actually works according to market principles is the export sector. And the export sector only works because of access to the American market. Now, we're only taking about 16% of Chinese goods. Up until a few years ago, Trump's first term, we were taking about 20% of China's exports. But America was by far the biggest market, and we paid on time, and we paid cash. Now, good luck getting paid on time and in cash from Africa or India or other places. It simply doesn't work that way. So losing part of the American market is a tremendous blow to the only part of the sector of the Chinese economy that operates according to market principles. And they've got nothing else. They've got no domestic consumption, in part because of the one-child policy, in part because nobody in China trusts the government. They want to hold on to their capital or get it out of the country as quickly as possible and buy a safe investment like a home in California or a home in Sydney. So the Chinese economy is in for some very, very dark days ahead. And I believe that the sooner the collapse comes, the sooner Xi Jinping will be forced, as Mao was, to either step back to what he called the second line or to be forced out of power altogether. He's alienated all of the other factions in China. He's alienated the followers of Jiang Zemin by purging members of his faction. He's alienated Hu Jintao's faction. In fact, he had Hu removed for health reasons from a meeting in front of the assembled senior leaders. That was tremendous loss of face for Hu Jintao. Tremendous. So he's alienated the factions in the Communist Party, leaving only his own, he wanted to leave only his own faction standing, and yet recently members of his own faction, generals that he's appointed, have been removed. That makes no sense. It makes no sense for Xi Jinping himself, who has only the support of his faction, to begin removing members of that faction. And the members of factions all protect one another. That's how they survive. And they all have hotai, they all have backup at the most senior levels of the Chinese Communist Party. And if those senior leaders get together, if they coalesce together, as I think they are now coalescing, then Xi Jinping's head will wind up on a silver platter in one way or another.
I want to revisit something that you mentioned when it came to your research and your time in China, where it came to a head and basically an ultimatum was given. Is that something that is still prominent, whether it be in media, if you have a bureau, if you're a Western media organization inside of China, as well as China scholars that really enjoy the access, whether it is a junket or some type of research that they want to do in China where you have to toe a certain line? Is there a concern that we've been contaminated as a society?
Well, I've been concerned about this for a very, very long time because we have in the United States an open society. And we also, because of our Judeo-Christian heritage, I think always try to assume the best of people. We try to put the best face on people's actions. We try to take them at their word, unless we're convinced otherwise. Our default position is to assume that people are being honest with us until proven otherwise. Everyone is innocent until proven guilty, right? That's what we say. That operating principle doesn't work very well with regard to China, because one has to assume that the communist official that you're dealing with is being duplicitous unless you have evidence that he's being honest. And I say that on the basis of long experience with communist officials, and I doubt if many people who have such experience would disagree with me, because every international agreement that the Communist Party has ever signed, and I say Communist Party deliberately instead of China, because I want people to understand that the Chinese people are the first and foremost victims of the Chinese Communist Party. And even if we say China, we're talking about the Chinese Communist Party and its misdeeds, and not the Chinese people themselves. In order to be on good terms with the Chinese Communist Party, you have to play nice. You have to say nice things about them. And if you do, you get invited on all expense paid junkets to China. You get visa, of course. First and foremost, you get a visa to go to China, and then you get an all expense paid trip to China. That was the story, of course, of Vice Presidential nominee Tim Walz, who was enamored of communist China and made many trips to China in the 80s and 90s. And his junkets, and he was accompanied by dozens of students on each of those trips, were paid for in part by the Chinese Communist Party's United Front Department. That's simply how they operate. And they never give up on anyone, you see. They're relentless. You would think that I would not be a very good candidate to be suborned in this way, to be enticed in this way. You would think that if they were to give up on anyone, they would give up on me, because I've been a critic of China since 1980 and will continue until my death. They have tried to get me to come to China. They have offered me all expense paid trips to China. They have offered me a visa. They have offered me lecture fees. They have tried to compromise me. Now, if they try to compromise me, they'll try to compromise anybody. And sadly, many, many people have been compromised. For many years, I held conferences on human rights in China, annual conferences. And I always invited members, representatives from the Falun Gong, because they are right there, first and foremost, among the groups who are being persecuted in China. I would invite China scholars to join me at these conferences. And more often than not, they would turn me down. And I don't want to mention names. They're famous names in the China scholarly community. But they would tell me, no, I want to keep my channels of communication open to China. I don't want to criticize the regime. So the Chinese Communist Party is very, very good at manipulating public opinion, at making sure that the people that it allows into China are hewing the party line and come back to spew party propaganda, or at least not say anything critical of Communist China.
I want you to, if you could, unpack for us what the United Front work department is. And from what I understand, there's a big emphasis placed on influence campaigns and the Chinese Communist Party's desire to influence Americans.
The Chinese Communist Party spends an enormous amount of money on influence operations. And it's hard to summarize what they do, because they seek chinks in our armor of all kinds. For example, at the high school and university level many years ago, they began setting up Confucius Institutes, purportedly to teach Chinese language courses, but actually, of course, to serve as propaganda outlets for the party and its party line. Those have become fairly well known and have been closed down in some circumstances. I mean, I testified before Congress 10 years ago about the need to close down all of the Confucius Institutes, and we're finally seeing that happen now. But that was just an opportunity that the Chinese Communist Party's United Front Department saw to worm its way into one particular group of American institutions, our institutions of higher education, and establish a presence. But think about that multiplied by 1,000. Think about the company that goes into a joint venture with China, and the technology is then forcibly or secretly transferred to China. Think about the Chinese company that operates here and has among its Chinese employees a Communist Party branch, and the Communist Party branch itself has a United Front operation ongoing. Think about the fact that China is still allowed to purchase inserts into major American newspapers and run propaganda articles. I don't think we've been able to place, and our Voice of America hasn't been able to place an article in the People's Daily for I don't know how long. I mean, reciprocity, we shouldn't be allowing that. Think about the fact that radio stations here are owned or controlled by Communist Party interests. I was involved in 1998 in the Cox Commission, which investigated the effort of China in the late 1990s to set up espionage shops in the United States. And at that time, Chris Cox, who was the head of the Cox Commission, estimated that there were 10,000 Communist Party front organizations set up in the United States. That was 27 years ago. How many front organizations of various kinds do we have now? Many more than 10,000. 20,000, 30,000, 40,000. Chairman Mao said that the Chinese Communist Party has three magic weapons, and they are propaganda and United Front tactics and the People's Liberation Army. Propaganda is used for what? Propaganda is used for a kind of effort at mind control. We're simply going to feed you misinformation until you believe what we tell you. United Front Department uses existing organizations that it penetrates, subverts, and then turns to party purposes over time, or it sets up front organizations like the secret police station in New York City, which pretended to be a place where Chinese immigrants could renew their Chinese driver's licenses. It was actually a secret police station, and we know there are such stations in other cities. That's what we mean by united front tactics. And the People's Liberation Army, of course, is the armed forces. And we're not in a kinetic war with China. I mean, we're obviously not firing bullets at each other. But we are at war with China across all domains except the kinetic. People need to realize that. In cyberspace, we're at war with China. China just set up a network of phony cell stations in New York City that would have taken down the entire communication system in the largest city in the United States. That's an incredibly aggressive thing to do. It is, at one level, an act of war. But China is at war with us across all domains, all the time. It is ceaseless.
Talk about sort of the process. It's kind of packaged in this, benign name, United Front. Doesn't seem too threatening, but as you talk about it, it seems like there's a slow creep of subversion and the end result reaching their desired effect. How does the United States in our free and open society that is very susceptible to such things combat this?
Well, the first thing we can't do is we can't become what we behold. I mean, we can't become like communist China, because we would then be defeating ourselves, right? And in an effort to defeat China, we would defeat ourselves, which would defeat our purpose. So I think the solution has to be strict reciprocity. If China is engaged in actions against us, then we tell them, unless we are allowed to do the same thing in China, you must stop. And so we let them set the parameters of the interaction. And unless we're allowed to open up a George Washington Institute on the Beijing University campus, they have to close down all of the Confucius Institutes. Well, since they will never allow us to do that, then the Confucius Institutes will be closed down. But we didn't do it. They did it by refusing reciprocity, you see. Unless we're able to publish a newspaper in Shanghai and distribute it freely to the Chinese people, they can't publish their newspapers here. Unless we're allowed to own a radio station and broadcast news and information from our viewpoint, from the American viewpoint, they're not allowed to own radio stations here. And on, across the board. And that way, we don't become like them, but we reject at the same time all of their United Front measures. Remember, the United Front Department is a department of the Chinese Communist Party. It is a weapon that the Chinese Communist Party is using, along with propaganda and along with People's Liberation Army, in order to achieve world domination. And their path to world domination runs through one country, and one country alone. Only one country stands in the way of China's domination of the world, and that is the United States.
Stephen Mosier just took us from the villages where tens of millions starved in communist China, to the clinics where unborn children were killed, to the modern influence campaigns reaching into our own institutions right here in America. A very rare perspective from someone who saw that system from the inside in China. His message, understanding the CCP isn't optional, but it's urgent. I'm Steve Lance. Thank you so much for joining this edition of One on One, and I'll see you next time.